Now to France, where in Paris things aren't quite what they used to be. When the average tourist thinks of Paris, what images spring most immediately to mind? The Eiffel Tower, certainly, a dominating feature of the city for nearly 100 years, in which time it's become the very symbol of Paris. The tourist will also recall, no doubt, the Paris of spacious squares and cooling fountains, of broad avenues and elegant bridges over the Seine. And, of course, one of the most beautiful skylines of any city in the world. But this romantic image of Paris is fading fast. In the last few years, new shapes have arisen on the city skyline, and their emergence has sparked a controversy which threatens to become a major political row. Many Parisians are angry that the government has allowed such buildings as these to be constructed along the banks of the Seine, Manhattan-style tower blocks against whose collective bulk even the Eiffel Tower itself seems diminished. All over the city, from Saint-Cloud to Montparnasse, from Place d'Italie to Belleville, are the signs of a frenzied building boom. Over 60 new skyscrapers have now risen above the old spires and domes of traditional Paris. They add up to the biggest urban renewal program since the 1850s, when Baron Haussmann tore up the medieval city and laid the foundations of modern Paris. Haussmann planned his city on a grand scale, with wide symmetrical avenues and straight arterial roads, and he gave Paris its east-west axis running from the Place de la Nation to the Arc de Triomphe, 3 kilometers of unmatched perspectives. Haussmann gave Paris better communications and a new city centre which brought it immense prestige among the capitals of Europe. But his plans did little for ordinary people who lived in crowded districts just out of the centre. Montmartre, for example, retained its narrow streets and tiny apartments. For nearly a century, little was done to improve facilities in these districts, and meanwhile increased urbanization and industrialization created new pressures and problems. The tourists are quite content to jostle shoulder to shoulder through the quaint streets of Montmartre. But for those Parisians who have to live and work here, as in other crowded areas in Paris, the realities of everyday life are less romantic. At the last check, a third of the city's houses lack private toilets. Another blight of Paris is traffic. Although the city is losing more and more of its population to the suburbs, the vast majority of jobs remain in town. And that means a twice-daily rush hour of enormous proportions. Today, 900,000 vehicles flow through the city every weekday. It's a nightmare for motorists and pedestrians alike. Seven years ago, it was decided to tackle all these urban problems in a new integrated master plan, and the developers began with this vision for a rundown area in the west of the city known as La Défense. The Défense plan envisaged the construction of 13 tower blocks for both offices and residential apartments. Pedestrians were to be separated from motor traffic in a pleasant landscaped setting. This is how it looks today, about halfway to completion. Instead of street names, signposts list the various towers. "12,000 people already work at La Défense, and when the project's complete, it will provide offices for 100,000 white-collar workers and homes for over 2,000 families. There will also be parks, pedestrian precincts and shopping centres. When La Défense was just a design on a drawing board, nobody took much interest in it. But now it's half built, it's getting more and more criticism. Its political opponents say it's transformed a former working-class area of Paris into an exclusive suburb for the rich. But the biggest outcry has been against the height of the towers, the tallest of which rises to nearly 600 feet. Even cabinet ministers were shocked when they saw this enormous shape looming incongruously behind the Arc de Triomphe, and the government's now considering how best to preserve the view that Haussmann created. Other areas of Paris have received similar treatment. 6 years ago, work began on the demolition of Montparnasse station in the center of Paris and the development of another residential and business center on the 35-acre site. The architect's plans contained the familiar monolithic office blocks, but the pièce de résistance was to be a 45-story skyscraper half as high as the Eiffel Tower. Today, the tower is nearly finished, and it's 17 stories higher than originally planned. The station facilities may have improved, but most Parisians don't think the price has been worth paying. To alight at Montparnasse these days is to feel an almost physical sense of intimidation from the huge monoliths towering 640 feet above the platforms. The Montparnasse Tower has ruptured the Paris skyline for good. Its brooding presence is noticeable from all parts of the city, and at close range the effect is overwhelming. The public uproar over Montparnasse led the prefect of police to announce new regulations limiting the height of new buildings in the city centre to 80 feet. The controversy over La Défense and Montparnasse has alerted the public to other so-called improvement projects, and the planners are likely to have a much tougher time realizing their next objective, a motorway along the left bank of the Seine past Notre Dame. The new road will run within 150 yards of the ancient cathedral walls. It'll be roofed over to allow people to walk on top, but many of the trees now situated pleasantly around the cathedral will have to go. The building boom has not, of course, been restricted to Paris itself. Over the last few years, the suburbs have been expanding rapidly to accommodate the growing numbers of people who work in the capital, but who cannot afford to live there. The attempt to build homes for these people quickly and cheaply has not always been crowned with success, and sociologists in France, as in many other developed nations, have discovered that the construction of large, anonymous concrete blocks frequently solves the problems of housing at the expense of the problems of living. People living in tower blocks in new communities all too often complain of loneliness, a sense of isolation, and sometimes even acute depression. But here at Grigny, just south of Orly Airport, they've tried a new approach. No faceless blocks of concrete, but gently undulating lines of low-rise flats. The essence of the scheme is a sense of space and freedom. There are no keep-off signs. Much of the street architecture at Grigny is a cross between an obstacle course and an adventure playground. In central Paris, pigeons are a menace. Here, they're part of the landscape. Grigny is clearly a brilliant idea. It's got imagination, ingenuity, and a sense of fun. but so far it's still an oddity. It can only be hoped that its qualities will be copied and developed by architects elsewhere, and not just in France. From one of the best estates in Paris to one of the worst. This is what the French call a bidonville, literally a tin can town. There are several of them dotted around Paris with a total population of more than 500,000. Here too the streets are used as a playground, but the comparison with Grigny ends there. Several bidonvilles have disappeared recently in a big clean-up campaign, but in those that remain, conditions are just as bad as they look. There's no running water and hardly ever any electricity, so the only means of heating or cooking are coal and paraffin stoves. The tin walls and roofs are baking hot in summer, and in winter the stoves are a constant fire risk. Down in the city centre, the planners are talking about the Paris of the year 2000. But for these Parisians, it's still the 19th century. Paris is not, of course, the only city with problems of planning. It's simply that they've come into sharper focus here because of the sheer speed at which change is taking place. Those who oppose the new skyline maintain that they're trying to preserve what they can of the Paris they know and love. Those who welcome the changes claim that it's no longer enough to talk about Paris as it is, but as it might be, or even as it has to be to meet the needs of the future. When the Défense scheme is finished in 5 years' time, they argue, Parisians will find themselves with one of the finest and most impressive commercial centres in the world. After all, they say, when the Eiffel Tower was built, it was bitterly attacked as a monstrous candlestick. Now everybody loves it. One day, perhaps, the same will be true of La Défense and Montparnasse.